Hey, I'm Matt Manny. Thanks so much for joining me for this session number 1, as we talk about the door of spiritual reconciliation. If you've got your study guide, go ahead and grab that 40 Days of Compassion study guide. What I love about this series of thoughts and these different sessions is that really each one we're going to talk about a door of compassion. Now, just to give you a little bit of backstory for this compassion campaign that we're talking about, that we're spiritual growth campaign, we're actually running at Greater Philly Church. Prior to this, when we were putting this all together, we went through a series called Open Doors. And really, as I was going through that series of Open Doors, it really struck me that compassion is really us opening a door for other people who can't open a door for themselves. And so when it comes to salvation, when it comes to a relationship with Jesus Christ, we're really inviting somebody into a relationship with Jesus, and we're opening that door, if you will, and letting them walk into this. We're inviting them into this relationship with Jesus. We also see that happening when it comes to leadership, selfless leadership, when it comes to helping those who are in poverty, when it comes to helping those who are sick, and really reaching the next generation. It covers all those different big challenges that we face in our society, and really the challenges Jesus faced in his ministry. Time and time again, Jesus talks about having compassion. It's a part of his message, of his ministry to people around him. And really, he calls us to that in the church today, 2,000 years later. So if you've got your study guides, go ahead and turn to session 1. If you have not read the opening session overview, I'd encourage you to take a moment to pause the video. I'll make a couple comments about the session overview, the story there. And then we'll talk about the scripture then is John chapter 9 as well. If you have not read that yet, go ahead and read John chapter 9. The reference there, verses 1 to 15, that's on page 30. I'd encourage you to go ahead and pause the video for just a minute and read that as a group. As you come back, what we find with the story in John chapter 9, it's an incredible story. We all find ourselves telling big stories. We talk about the football game and how we played football maybe in high school and the big game that we won. We talk about stories about fishing, and we say we caught a fish this big or this big, so big it's outside the screen. But we all have a story we like to tell, stories we love to share, stories that help us connect to each other. And as we talk about the story, what's amazing is the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are really just a collection of people's stories. It's a collection of the stories of Jesus. And what's most profound about those stories is most often it's stories of people who have an interaction with Jesus and their lives are dramatically changed and transformed. One of the challenges for us is when it comes to sharing Jesus with people, we can be extremely intimidated because, we don't feel like we have the competency or the know-how. How exactly do we go ahead and share Jesus with somebody when we may not have all the answers? We may not know all the answers. And so we can become kind of timid a little bit, if you will. And so our goal with this, as we look through the story of the man who was born blind, it's really going to address some issues that we find as well with when it comes to compassion, because compassion likes to look at a situation and say, do I get involved and do I help? Because the same line of thinking that the disciples had in this story, as we'll unpack this, is the same line of thinking we have many times today when it comes to helping those who are struggling with wherever they're at in life, their place in life, and do we show them compassion? As you look on page 31, the video outline, we see there that compassion fuels your Jesus story. Compassion fuels your Jesus story. As we talk about the story of the blind man from John chapter 9, where a question for us is this: how do you create opportunities to share your story? How do you create opportunities to share your story? Before we jump into John chapter 9 and we unpack really how the blind man shares his story, here's just a couple of thoughts for us. Number one is this: pray for opportunities. We can start simply by praying for opportunities. We pray that God would lead us to people and people to cross our paths that have an interest, that have a curiosity about Jesus. Usually, and we'll talk about this, there's 2 signs to look for, and we'll catch that 2 signs at the end of this session. 2 signs to look for when we can talk to somebody about Jesus. So first of all, pray for opportunities. Then number 2 is this: love others out loud. Love others out loud. Take the first step. People are more inclined to listen to us when we ask them questions, when we show kindness to them. There's an old saying that you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Now, if you're in the business of catching flies, that makes a lot of sense. But if not, it sounds kind of crazy, a little strange, a little kind of something your grandma might say to you. But the idea is this, that you can interact with people and engage people much better when you are agreeable, when there's a little bit of give and take, when you show kindness and interest in them. God has given us 2 ears and 1 mouth. The idea is listen twice as much as we speak. Hey, I struggle with that a lot. So as we look here, we love others out loud. What does that mean? To show people in a practical way that we care about them. Now, the encouragement is this. When it comes to sharing Jesus, ultimately our goal is to talk to them about Jesus and invite them to put their faith and trust in Jesus. Now, we don't want it to be a sneaky kind of thing and an ulterior motive, but the goal is this: we just love anybody and everybody, and that opens up the door then for us to share Jesus with them. And then the third encouragement for us, how to have opportunities to share your story, well, invest in relationships and then invite other people to into your life. Invite them into your rhythms and routines. Invite them to church. Invite them over to your house. Invite them to spend time together. But just inviting and engaging people will build a relationship where you can begin to share with them about the hope that you have in Jesus as well. What we find then is this: as we begin to invest in people and we have a relationship with them, it's really tricky in our day and age, because sometimes we find ourselves being a little bit standoffish when we find that, well, somebody trying to sell me something, is somebody trying to convince me to do something against my will. Here's what you and I both know. If you're a follower of Jesus, you know that Jesus makes our lives better and he makes us better at life, that Jesus makes all the difference in our life here on this earth and our life for eternity. But sometimes it can be difficult because 2 things we don't ever talk about are religion and politics, right? And so we struggle because, well, we don't know where people are at when it comes to their faith and their belief. Many people, they have this sense that God doesn't care, or if God really cared, then he wouldn't have allowed something bad to happen to them, or wouldn't allow their loved one to get sick and die, whatever the situation might be. So many times people have deep questions and deep longings and frustrations about understanding God, that you can help with time answer those questions. But we're playing the long game. This is not a quick win. This is not something that we're trying to hurry up and hustle through and put a trophy on our wall. This is something we're going to take time because we really truly care about people, because we really truly care about their eternity. What we're going to find is this: when it comes to telling your story, you can talk to somebody and talk to them and find out where they're at. And as they begin to say, well, how do you have peace in your life? When they share about the lack of peace maybe in their life. And how do you deal with your stresses when they talk about dealing with their stresses? And when they talk and say, how do you have a good marriage when I'm struggling with my marriage? Don't you struggle with your marriage too? I just feel like, am I the only one? And you can talk to them, hey, yeah, this is how I struggled through my marriage. And each of those instances, you can always come back to, my faith makes all the difference. My relationship with Jesus makes all the difference. And then this is what you can share. There's 3 ways you can talk to them. 3 parts to telling your story. Number 1 is this: I was. This is like what my marriage was like before I met Jesus. This is what my life was like before I met Jesus. This was how I dealt with problems before I met Jesus. This is what I was like. And you don't have to spend a lot of time on that. People can get the idea of what your past story was. But then you put a little bit more time into talking about how Jesus made a change in your life. How did you come to know Jesus? Was it through going to a church service? Was it through studying on your own? Was it through somebody leading you to Jesus? Many times you can talk about, hey, this is the person who poured into my life and showed and shared with me about Jesus. And then number 3, you can explain that I'm now and talk about the benefits of how Jesus has transformed your life. And you want to spend the most time here talking about how Jesus has dramatically transformed your life. I was, but Jesus, and I'm now. I'm now at peace. I'm now at a place where I have purpose. I'm now a mom or a dad or a brother or a sister, somebody who has this direction in my life and a peace in my life. I now have a relationship with Jesus. I have a relationship with God. And I now have, I know that I have forgiven. I have a home in heaven. I'm now at peace with God. That's what it comes back to. The gospel is all about coming to peace with God. And so we find ourselves then. That brings us to this question. How has Jesus changed your life? How exactly do you go about doing that? There's no better place then to go to John chapter 9, where we see this man who was born blind. Jesus is walking through Jerusalem one day, and he sees this man who's begging, and he's blind. And the disciples ask Jesus this really important question. Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, here's our connection for us. We might look at that and we say, that's crazy. In nowhere in culture would you ever blame somebody for their physical state because of sinfulness. Now, we might say they made a bad decision or a bad choice, but this man being born blind, did he do something wrong in the womb? Did he do something wrong that he was just cursed to be blind? Is this God just playing some kind of cosmic joke and trick on this man? Or was it because his parents sinned? They did something wrong and made a bad choice, and now here he is. How does it translate to today? Many times we see people around us, and our thought is this. If we see somebody who's struggling, we easily go to this thought process. They must have made a bad decision to end up where they're at. They wouldn't be in this situation, whether it's a financial struggle or a relationship issue or a job struggle or maybe a health issue. If they would have made better choices and decisions, they probably wouldn't be where they're at today. That's many of us. That's the line of thinking we have. It's no different than the disciples. What's Jesus' response? Jesus' response, he flips the script and says, neither, not this man. He couldn't have sinned when he was in the womb. He couldn't have, God predetermined that he was going to make a bad decision in his life, and so he's going to be cursed with blindness, and it wasn't his parents. Jesus' response is this, neither this man nor his parents, but that God's power might be expressed and shown, that God's power might be put on display. And so what happens? As we come to this story, if you take your lesson session book, we'll go ahead and look there. How to tell your story based on this man's response. We see, first of all, we find this. Tell your story. Well, you just start by telling your story. I know it sounds kind of simple and kind of like a give me, but the idea is this: you just tell what happened to you. As you look in your notes there, you see, tell people what happened in your life. You just talk about life. As people talk about their lives, you talk about your life. As you look there, you see this. The Pharisees, well, they're poking around and they're finding out that this man was healed, and they have questions themselves. And so as you look there in your notes, it says the Pharisees asked the man all about this healing. So he told them, he put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, he says, I could see. Out of John 9, chapter 9, verse 15. So he tells his story. Many times for us, when it comes to telling our stories, we're fearful of, well, I need to embellish it, or I need to make it really believable. And all he does, he simply says, I was, but Jesus, I'm now. If you look there, he says, he put mud on my eyes, and that's the Jesus part. And when I washed it away, I could now see. I was blind, but now I can see. For your story, all you have to do is you talk about the impact Jesus made in your life. Number 2 then, the second step, tell who Jesus is to you now. Tell who Jesus is to you. We jump ahead to John chapter 9, verse 17, as you look in your notes there. Then the Pharisees again, that first answer that the man gave in verse 15 wasn't good enough. They questioned him again. They questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion about this man who healed you? And the man replies, I think he must be a prophet. That's all he knew Jesus to be. Now for you and I, Jesus, well, you say, but he's more than a prophet, right? That's all that he knew about Jesus at that point in his relationship with Jesus. Now for you, when you follow Jesus, the more you get to know Jesus, the more you spend time with Jesus, the more you read the Bible, the more that you go to church, you're going to talk about and interact and think about Jesus like you think about a friend. And so when somebody says, well, what's Jesus? What difference has he made in your life? You just talk about him like you would talk about a friend. Jesus gives me peace. Jesus helps me when I'm worried. Jesus helps me when I'm stressed out. Well, it's really hard sometimes for people to make a connection between the invisible and the metaphysical. Jesus, you can't see. I mean, do you see Jesus? And well, if you see Jesus, isn't that crazy? Yeah, but I know a peace that passes understanding. In my life, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, that I am with you always. What does that look like? Well, that's the Holy Spirit living within us, but that we know God is for us, that Jesus is with us, that we know that he loves us. And so it makes all the difference in the world. As we find who is Jesus to you, you can share with that person Jesus and the impact that he's made on your life. Number 3 then, trust God to change lives. When people ask you, who is Jesus to you, you can find yourself maybe being a little bit defensive. Sometimes people who are skeptical, who are critical, who don't necessarily believe in Jesus, they may find themselves, I don't know about your story. Then what do? Do you have to argue and try to demand people to come over to your conclusion? Look what the session notes say there on page 32. God can work in the lives of your family and friends even when they don't understand and even when they might be skeptical and critical. In verse 18, it says, the Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man. They didn't believe that he had been blind and could now see. So they called his parents. So they're pressing his parents. And they asked them, is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he see? Now his parents, well, they get a little bit flustered and they find pressure. They say, we know this is our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. So there's the pressure there, who had announced that anyone saying Jesus was Messiah would be expelled from the synagogue. That's why they said he's old enough. Ask him. You might find yourself where your parents or people that are close to you, maybe a loved one or a friend or even a spouse, may be putting pressure on you because of your faith in Jesus. They might be skeptical. They may not believe how you do. And when you feel that pressure, you say, well, what do I do? The answer isn't to try to dominate them and try to convince them with some kind of convincing, kind of maybe like a magic spell. If you say the right words, like hocus pocus, you can get them to believe. Well, we all know that doesn't work. Some kind of magic spell won't work to bring somebody over to belief. That's not how Jesus even intended for it to work. But what we can do is we can simply keep pointing back to what Jesus did in our lives, what he's done for us. We don't have to try to convince people. We can trust God to do the work in people's lives. All God has asked us to do is not change people, but just love people and just tell them, well, what Jesus has done for us, and to show them by how we love them and how we treat them. Our goal isn't to force them into belief, but our goal is simply to be able to help them come to our position, to the position of belief, to your position, on their own terms. It may take some time. You know where you stand with Jesus. I know where I stand with Jesus. And if I force somebody into my position, it never ever works. A person forced against their will is unpersuaded still. The thought is this: can I present Jesus so that as a person, step by step, with time, that God can work through their heart? We don't have to rush the process. We can let the Holy Spirit, let God work in a person's life, and we just say what we need to say, love how we need to love, and just wait on God as he simply and consistently draws and calls somebody into a relationship with him over time. Then we find, what's the next step? Trust God. And number 4, keep your story simple. You don't have to get real fancy with it. You can keep it simple. Verse 24, it says, for the second time, boy, these Pharisees are persistent. For the second time, they called the man in who had been born blind and told him, God should get the glory for this because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. And I absolutely love what this guy says, what the man who was born blind says. In verse 25, I don't know whether he is a sinner. He says, I can't tell you his spiritual state. The man replies, but this is what I do know. I was blind and now I can see. That's awesome. What a difference that Jesus made in his life. That is the I was, but Jesus, I'm now. I don't know all the answers. People are going to have all kinds of questions for you. They're going to throw all kinds of things at you. Are there aliens in outer space? How does a good God allow bad things to happen? I don't have all the answers to those things, but what I do know is I used to be totally stressed out. I do know that my marriage was on the rocks. I do know that my life was a mess. I do know what life was like without Jesus. And I absolutely know what life is like with Jesus, that Jesus makes all the difference. The irony here is this, and we'll just point this out for just a moment. The Pharisees, they say God should get the glory because we know this man, Jesus, is a sinner. They totally missed the point. If you remember, the disciples and the Pharisees, they had some challenges in their thinking and their approach to the situation. The disciples said, who sinned? And Jesus' response was, neither. This is about God getting the glory. And the Pharisees say, Jesus is a sinner. God should get the glory. Do you see how strange and how ironic the story is? Now, as you look in your notes there, we see this. When it comes to people, when they are most open, I mentioned earlier in the session opener, when are people most open to hearing about Jesus? There's two times. When they're in times of transition and when they're in times of tension or what we'd call trouble. Transition and tension, or transition and trouble. And you need to listen for the nots. Listen for these statements. I'm not doing well. I'm not prepared for this. I'm not close to God. I'm not from around here. Maybe they moved in, they're transitioning into an area for a new job or for school or whatever the situation might be. But then you look here, here's ideas for you to share your story. And we'll just go through these quickly. But here are some just quick seed thoughts for you to think about. Write your story out and share it with people. Maybe you're somebody who you like to have it written out so you can go ahead and explain it and share it with somebody. Maybe you want to write it out and email it to a friend, or write it out and mail it to a family member. Number two, invite people to hear your story at church or in a group. Maybe you're in your small group, you maybe share your story, or maybe you've been asked to share your testimony at church or in another setting, maybe with some people, and you can go ahead and invite your family, invite your friends and say, hey, I'm giving a talk and I'm sharing my story and I'd love for you to be there and support me and hear about the story. Three, share your story anytime in conversation. When you have a moment when somebody says, hey, I'm really struggling, I'm not doing well, next line of questioning can be this. What is helping you get through? Or do you have anything to help you get through and deal with the stress and the struggles and the tension? And whatever they might say, well, actually, I'm kind of like, I'm trying to find myself like just escaping away. So when I get home from work, I just want to kick my feet up and sit and just veg on the couch. Or I'm finding that I go on the weekends, I try to get out as much as I can and be out with friends and things like that. And the response for us can be, hey, I've been there. I get what it's like. And if I could share with you, what the real change has been for me, what's really made the biggest difference? And when the response is, well, yeah, what made the big difference for you? You can say, hey, my faith in Jesus made all the difference for me. I have a neighbor who I've talked to and going through some challenges and things like that. And they've asked and said, I'm trying to get through what I'm going through. And my response to them is, I know where they stand. They're not really interested in the gospel. They're not really interested. And I'm in the process of just sharing with them little by little about Jesus. And so as we've talked, I said, listen, I know you're not a person of faith. I know you don't believe in God. But here's what I will tell you. I am a person of faith, and Jesus has made all the difference in my life. In that moment, they didn't get down on their knees and pray the sinner's prayer and get saved, but it was just a seed thought. It was the start for them to begin to think about that. We're not in a rush to force them to a decision, but just sharing Jesus and giving them the gospel little by little with time, one interaction after another. Another way to share is share your story when you're serving with someone. Hey, when you're doing something together, you have a common bond, a common opportunity. Number 5, listen to someone else's story and then share your story. Kind of a give and take kind of situation. Pray with someone who's going through a tough time and share your story. If someone shares with you that you're really struggling, a great way to segue is to, hey, can I pray with you right now about this situation? Can I pray with you? We're going to talk in just a couple sessions about how some different compassion projects that you can do and incorporate prayer with that. Build a friendship over time and share how Jesus changed your life. Number 8, look for people who are in transition and in tension and encourage them maybe with your story, just like we said a moment ago. Listen for the knots to be able to share your story. And then, as we started off, pray for opportunities. Hey, thank you so much for joining me for this session. I'd encourage you to go ahead and jump into the discussion questions and then work through the response section. Talk through what kind of compassion project could your group consider. Now, here's one thing I will say about the compassion project. For each of the 5 challenges, there are compassion project ideas for each one of those. You don't have to do all 5 compassion projects for each one of the challenges, but I would encourage you to pick one, something that maybe for your group as a whole, you might say, hey, this really kind of strikes a chord with us, something that we really feel passionate about. And over time, once you do one compassion project, the goal would be eventually to try another one of the challenges and do a compassion project with that. And so look at the ideas there for the compassion project and then wrap up your time in a word of prayer. In the next session, we're going to talk about how to have compassion when it comes to selfless leadership in session number 2. Thanks so much for joining me.